Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure, albeit virtually, to have you all with us for the inaugural plenary session of the IEFA's Montreal Conference. We're tackling the hugely important and difficult issue of how we can move forward towards a fairer and a greener world. I have a lot of questions for our panelists, and I'm sure you do too. I encourage you to post your questions in the chat, and they'll be sent to us by our organizers. We'll try and take them if we can during the conversation. I want you to feel part of it, but definitely we'll leave some time at the end. With that bit of housekeeping out the way, let me introduce the fantastic panel that's joining me for this session. With us, we have Odile Renaud-Bassot, President of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Bienvenue, Madame.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. We have Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, or the ILO.
Hello.
Hello. And Leslie Maasdorp, who is the Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank in Shanghai, I think, Leslie, is that right? Thank you for letting us run into your evening. It's great to have all three of you here. Now, very few people would say they don't want a fairer society, or indeed that they're opposed to a greener world per se. The problem is that there's a perception, or indeed perhaps an actual tension between these two goals. Asking the less well-off, be that low-income countries or disadvantaged groups within developed countries, to bear the costs that are associated with decarbonisation is a hard ask, and it may slow progress towards a fairer society. That said, putting socioeconomic equity above everything else may slow the progress that's really urgently needed to fight climate change. I'd like to start off by getting the panel's overview on whether they think this is a false dichotomy or whether there is indeed a tension, and if so, some preliminary thoughts on how they may be thinking about resolving those two issues. Odile, may I start with you, perhaps?
Well, thank you very much, and very happy to be here today to discuss this very, very important challenge and addressing this tension you were mentioning, because indeed I'm completely convinced that, first of all, climate change is a major challenge and a major task for the generation of our time. I think that when looking at what happened in the last few months, the very exceptional event on the climate front, from very high heat in Canada, fire in a lot of European countries, a flood in another European countries. So I think, with a huge cost on life, but also, on the countries themselves and the natural environment also, this shows how acute and urgent the challenge is. We also have to have in mind the IPCC report a few weeks ago, which shows, now we have a very strong consensus from scientists on, first of all, the acceleration of climate change and the responsibility of our activity on this. So I think the objective is very clear, and if we want to avoid a disaster, we really need to target this 1.5 increase maximum, and which means halving emission by half in 2030 and aiming at net zero emission in 2050. This is a huge challenge, and this is really at the core of what we are doing at EBRD, with an objective of having 50% of our financing in the green area, being fully Paris-aligned, providing support to the countries in which we intervene to define their strategy, how to reach this objective, and how they can, how to adjust to this transition. We've provided up to 38 billion of financing in the last 5 years. And I think with a very strong focus on the private sector, so to support the private sector through the banking sector, financial intermediaries, but also targeting, for example, industries in order to reduce the emission and to green industrial production. So we are really trying to intervene at all levels of our activities, in order to facilitate and to support this green transition. Of course, the question you raised about the impact and how to ensure that this is a just transition, it's absolutely key. I would say that there are two levels for this question. The first one is that in any case, the transition we need to do is such that it will it will trigger a reorganization of the way we work, of the way we live, of every kind of activities. So that will be costly. And I think that the issue is we absolutely need to do that, because the alternative, not acting, will cost much more. And I think that with what happened, we've seen in the COVID situation, that prevention or acting early is better than waiting for the catastrophe to arrive. I think that we realized, we heard about pandemics, but nobody really prepared. And then when it came, it was a huge cost and huge major trouble, impact on human life and so forth. So we need to prepare, and we need to spend the resources to prepare. But we need to ensure, because we know also that this transition will have a very different cost on different people. And for example, we work in a lot of countries which have a lot of coal activities. In some of our countries, 70% of the energy comes from coal. And we know that if we want to decarbonize, ending coal is the priority. And therefore, we need to design, and that's what we've been doing, program in order to support the region, the cities, the population which are the most affected by the transition. And for example, we've been closing some, helping companies to close some activities in the mining sector in coal in North Macedonia, and at the same time developing solar plant in the same region in order to take over. This is, this kind of approach we need to develop. Also reskilling people in order to ensure that they are accompanied through the transition. And so there is this just transition, I think, approach, which is at the core of the EU approach of the Green Deal, but also of banks like us, will be key moving forward in order to help the acceptance and the people going through the transition.
Thank you. Leslie, perhaps I could turn to you. Odile was talking about some of the flash flooding or problems caused by climate change. Shanghai, China has seen also the same sort of problems. Perhaps I could ask you to tackle the same question.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I agree with everything that Madame Odile has just outlined. I'd like to start by saying that the issues of just transition is right at the center of the debate of how we find a collective, global, coordinated deal with and to mitigate the impact of climate change. As you know, there will be winners and there will be losers. And it's very important that we look at how do we manage the inequities associated with the different strategies that are currently in place. Let me just give one or two specific examples. The European Union is providing very critical leadership in the climate space, and so is China, as well as the United States, because these three blocks, as you know, constitute about 50% of global emissions. However, if these three leading global players move so much ahead of other emerging markets, it could simply lead to a displacement of carbon-intensive production moving to other emerging markets. And also, if, for example, as you know, the European Union passed a very critical milestone law in 2019, the so-called EU Green Deal. If as a consequence of that, we would find that emerging markets products will get effectively taxed as they enter the European Union. That could be seen as, if you like, discriminatory against emerging markets, because, as you know, Swaha, the emerging markets bear less historical responsibility for climate change. Let's just take Africa, where I'm from. I'm from South Africa, and the entire continent contributes less than 4% of global emissions. European Union, as you know, is around 15%, China to 27%, and so on. So the imposition of cost has to be considered through the lens of how do we ensure equity. In my country, for example, we've got a massive energy grid system that is coal-based. Large numbers, thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs are dependent on the coal industry. So making sure that in this transition that we are able, as Madame Odila just said, that we can provide transition, retraining, for example, reskill workers, develop new industries so that those cities do not become sort of deserted, economic, forgotten areas. So in short, I guess what I'm saying is that we have to look at this through the lens of the differential impact on emerging markets because we are in a less fortunate position.
Thank you, Leslie. Hi, let me turn to you. You're not necessarily financing in the way a multilateral development bank would be, but you're very much, your organization, the ILO, is very much at the heart of the thinking of some of the things Odile and Leslie are talking about, like reskilling, the differential and intergenerational, but also within countries, the things. Can I ask you to sort of take the same question from the ILO's point of view?
Yeah, sure. To answer your original question, Soha, is there inevitable contradiction between greener? The answer is no, there is no inevitable contradiction. And to be a bit teleological about it, look at the final result. We must ensure that there is no contradiction. What do I mean by that? My feeling is, and I think experience shows, that action to combat climate change, however well-intentioned it might be, that does not meet certain criteria and measures of fairness, of social justice, are liable to produce very strong political and social resistance, not accepted. So whilst there is no automatic correspondence between what is green and what is fair, if things are not fair, they won't be accepted. They will be stopped at the starting line, in my view. So if you look at the fairness sort of side of this equation, I think you've got to split it into two concepts of fairness. One is the international piece, and I think Leslie's just gone to that. I think the Paris deal was, a recognition that there are differential responsibilities historically for climate change. There are differential capacities to pay for what needs to be done to mitigate and to so you've got the international fairness piece, and the fact that the $100 billion a year of climate financing that was a pivotal part of the Paris Agreement has not been realized, I think already puts one big crack in the equation, which we have to be conscious of. So you've got the global fairness agenda, and some ways I think it might be the most difficult piece to address. The other is if you just sort of boil down to in-country, communities, industrial fairness issues. The fact of the matter is, whilst we all churn out, and the ILO is no exception, rather encouraging sort of statistics saying, guess what, if we do the right things, we'll create more jobs than we destroy. That's great. But those jobs are not in the same places, they're not the same people, and they won't pay the same terms and conditions of work. And there will be, as has already been said, in the most sort of simplistic terms, winners. And if we're going to say, well, too bad, because climate change is the overriding existential threat, we're going to have to live with those social, unfortunate social consequences. I fear that it just won't happen. It just won't happen because people will say no, they'll dig their heels in and we'll get into the type of log jams that have already too frequently arrested or retarded climate change action. So we need to look very, very consciously and in a very, very concentrated way, in a way that's become a little bit unfashionable, what I call the re-engineering of labour markets and sectoral policies and industrial policies. It's hard work. It requires investment. I'm not sure we've got all the institutions in place to do it, but it is crucial to that other, more micro element of fairness. So you've got, I think, those two elements of fairness that we need to address almost as a precondition for creating the greener future that, as you say, everybody wants.
Absolutely. Let me ask Odile and Leslie just to drill into a little bit about what Guy is talking about. Odile, especially your friend, and the Gilets jaunes sort of had a worldwide impact with the protests. Those protests were perhaps triggered by sort of a fuel duty increase plan by the government, but there were a confluence of a lot of different grievances and, unhappinesses about different things. We have a huge increase at the moment in gas prices in Europe. Gas prices, energy prices around the world are high, but they're particularly high for gas in Europe. So you're getting at a time when politicians are talking about the cost of decarbonisation. You've got households already facing very high bills this coming winter. What do you think, Leslie, your institutions could do? Are you concerned about the sort of no coming from the starting block that Guy's talking about at the moment?
I mean, it's a complex issue because, in a way, I think that as economists and thinking about what is the best way to ensure that we deal with the transition in a manner which is cost efficient, which is the most, where we bring private sector, where we align all the productive capacity on the objective of the transition, we know that carbon pricing is a key. Is absolutely key. I'm sure you've heard the IMF saying if we want to succeed in the transition, we need to have a carbon price because this is the only way to measure the externalities. If we don't have economic signaling pricing for the externalities, we won't manage the transition. You can have also regulation. This may be helpful, law or forbid or define regulation for the building emission, heating emission, and so forth. But at the end of the day, I think we know, and everything we learn from economics is that carbon price and the pricing of externalities is absolutely key so as to get everybody aligned. But we know also that carbon price may have, and this was shown in the Gilets jaunes, what happened in France with the Gilets jaunes, may have a very impact on the distribution, social, poorest people have been in big trouble to finance heating, transporting, and so forth. So I think that what needs to be thought through is how to, while developing carbon pricing and having a reasonable price for carbon in order to trigger the transition, we find ways to compensate, to help, to support, and to have financial transfer for those people who cannot sustain that, but then having the both sides of the equation. I think this is absolutely needed because if we don't manage to go to carbon price, I think we will never deliver. But we need to be able to go there. We need to find also the accompanying mechanism of transfer, support, subsidiary, and so forth. And it's true at the countries level, across different categories of the population, different side of, social inequalities in a country, but also probably globally, where you need to have some support for those countries that will be the most affected. And I think this will be all the discussion of COP26. I mean, a big part of the discussion of COP26, how to ensure that we will reach this 100 billion that have been committed and that we can accompany the countries to their transition. There is something, however, is important to say is that transition is not only a cost, it can be also a huge opportunity for some countries. And for example, when you look at the price of renewable energy, for Africa can be a big producer of renewable energy at a very, very cheap cost. I mean, in the project we finance, I think the price of solar energy in Egypt has been the lower we ever done in any country of operation. So it can also rebalance and contribute for some countries to create new asset, new capacity, new key resource that will be positive for their development.
Leslie, let me turn the question over to you. I'll ask you if you have any sort of ideas to supplement Guy's thoughts.
A couple of points. First point that I'd like to make, though, it is very important at this time to reinforce and strengthen global multilateral institutions that are designed, that are been set up to deal with problems that are transnational, like climate change, like global pandemics, etc. So multilateral institutions have a very important role to play. This crisis of COVID demonstrated or reinforced again the importance of these institutions. Without the G20, without the IMF, without EBRD, New Development Bank, etc., we would not be in the situation where we are today. The second point I would like to make is that one of the positive outcomes of this crisis is that it shifts the lenses of our entire system of production of the economy into the longer term. What net zero have done and the objective of climate neutrality is that companies are looking into this through the lens of 2050. I can guarantee you very few companies in the past developed 2050 strategies. So governments are very much focused on 4-year electoral cycles. They now need much longer term plans around carbon neutrality. Multilateral banks, by design, we have this advantage that we are focused on the long term because we are focused on development impact. So I'd like to just highlight that aspect. The second key point that I'd like to make, and Madame Odile is from France, so she would know this better, but even in France, as you just mentioned, the Yellow Vest movement that started in 2017 as a consequence of the lifting of the fuel subsidy. It shows you that this tension, inherent tension between the concerns of the end of the month of people needing to pay their bills and our more existential challenge of end of the world around climate change is very, very real. And you're talking about France, which is a developed country. It will be even more acute in less developed, poorer parts of the world. Again, it brings me to this whole notion that at the heart, as we dealt with COVID, I think one of the real unfortunate outcomes of COVID is that we did not demonstrate as much global solidarity as was needed to end the crisis everywhere, because you cannot end COVID somewhere unless you end it everywhere. And vaccine solidarity only really became much later in the day that we acted in that manner. So I think it's important to bring those principles into this debate.
Let me ask you, I mean, both you and Odile are making a really great point about multilateral institutions. Guy, you work for an international one as well, perhaps not in the same way of financing, but still. I mean, one of the issues, they are able to look large, look long term, but they're also answerable to a range of shareholders with different interests, different priorities, sometimes conflicting. We see this not just in multilateral development banks, but even in fora like the G20. Now, those sort of conflicts can sometimes produce great leaps forward, but they can also sometimes end up with a lowest common denominator solution, which is not ideal and doesn't move the needle fast enough, as fast as we need, on either achieving better social justice or climate change. I'd like to ask you how each of you in your institutions see and navigate those conflicts of interest. Odile, let me start with you.
No, you're right. We have shareholders, different views, some of them, different perspective, different starting point, interest, and so forth. On the other hand, what strikes me on this issue is the fact that this debate on inequalities is much stronger than it used to be 10 or 15 years ago. And now when you look at the priorities of the different institutions, including IMF, World Bank, EBRD, and yes, most of the MDBs, the inequality dimension, and showing that we fight against inequalities. There is a dimension which is gender equalities, but also more broadly to address the inequalities. And in the context of the post-COVID, I think we are all aware that this would have increased in the countries the risk of inequalities because of the services function and informal economies which have not been supported and so forth. So I think that this is much more at the core of all the MDB's institution and the international institutions than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and when we were talking about the Washington Consensus. So I think this is despite all the differences of views and so forth, there is a shared understanding, I think, among shareholders that we need to address these issues if we want, in order to support open economies, to support multilateralism and so forth. But otherwise, it's a bit like if we do not address just transition, we will not get transition. I think there is an understanding that if we are not taking this issue of inequalities, we will not be able to support international cooperation and so forth. This being said, I think that what happened last year, in the course of last year, showed how the position of some key players at the global level, like the US, can shift also the dynamics of the discussion. And I think that we are at a point when, with the new US administration much more involved and committed, coming back to the Paris Agreement and so forth, this has also changed the dynamic of the discussion on this agenda compared with 2 years ago. Even if with when the US withdrew, everybody else, I mean, there were continued support to the Paris Agreement, and it was not, but still the dynamic was different. So I think that that this is what I would say on this issue. I think that despite also, last point I wanted to make is, despite all the differences of interest and so forth, there is, and we see that across our shareholders in the discussion we have, there is no question on the need to address the climate change and to go for a green transition. There are more discussion on the modalities, the financial flow, the level of support, the 100 billion, what to do with, how to go about the transition, whether gas could play a role or not play a role. And so, but the overall objective, I think, is very, very much shared.
Thank you. Guy, let me ask you, I mean, obviously you're coming at it from a slightly different angle, but you're giving advice to countries, you're looking across the globe. What's your view on the multilateral sort of lowest common denominator risk?
Yeah, thanks very much. And you give me the opportunity perhaps to react to some of the things that have been said by other panelists. Look, I think the multilateral arena has been a difficult place in the last decade or more. I would say that probably the last really notable achievements that everybody would tick off as great achievements in multilateralism, it was in 2015. It was the Paris Agreement. It was also the UN 2030 development agenda. Since then, it's been a difficult place to make progress for geopolitical reasons, for various reasons. But it's been tough. It's been tough work. These have been hard yards. And as you rightly point out, and others have rightly pointed out, multilateral action, effective multilateral action, and a feeling of common purpose is, without that, climate change, is just not going to get addressed in any effective way. So I subscribe to everything that people have said about that. Now, what's COVID-19? What's the experience looking at a slightly shorter time frame? What's that done to us? Well, I agree with Leslie when he says, it's given us a new perspective on life. I mean, when you're faced with a sort of existential sort of shock or wake-up call that COVID has given us, it does allow people, I think, to look in a different perspective at very basic problems of their own lives and of the global community. The unfortunate part of this, of course, it allows us to say, yeah, things can be done differently. We can lead our lives differently. There are different policy settings that can replace the familiar ones that maybe haven't got us where we want to go. I think that's a good thing. The bad thing is, when it comes to dealing with COVID, I don't think the multilateral system has produced the goods. We haven't really delivered on vaccination rollout and distribution. We're certainly not doing it now on finance. I mean, there is a very, very big worry out there now that whilst we're all talking about global economic recovery, we're on a twin track here, what people are increasingly calling the great divergence, with the wealthier, industrialized, advanced part of the world bouncing back to their pre-pandemic levels of production relatively quickly, with all the differences we know about, but the developing and emerging world getting left behind. Why? Because they don't have access to vaccines and they don't have the fiscal firepower, which others can bring to the task of economic stimulation. The danger is that is replicated in the field of climate change. Now, COP26 is going to be a big test, I think, about whether the world and the multilateral system is stuck in the rut, which I think vaccine politics has put it in, or whether we can do slightly better on climate change. And again, Odile has said some very important things. We do need to tackle issues of carbon pricing, it seems to me. We need, international policymakers need to, for one reason, perhaps amongst others, to give the policy settings that global market and the private sector are waiting for. When the private sector has certainty about the price of carbon in the future, as happened after Paris, their investment decisions and financial markets are going to behave in a way which is going to crowd in funding to the things we want to see. We won't be relying simply and entirely on public funding, which is liable to fall short for reasons we all know. So I think a lot hinges around this capacity of the multilateral system to step up. And just to return to my piece on inequality, it is good to hear. By the way, just transition as a concept has now become common currency. We're all talking about just transition, the need to reconcile climate change objectives with development and social justice objectives and employment objectives. That's now part of the narrative, and that's really very, very encouraging. And we all talk about inequality and the dangers of excessive inequality. There's even an SDG in the 2030 agenda about reducing inequality. Any notion that inequality was not a problem, I think, was contradicted by the fact that SDG 10 talks about bringing down inequality. My question is, what do we see as the policies? We talk about reducing inequality as a goal. We have much greater difficulty in saying exactly, right, how are we going to do that? Is it going to be through fiscal action? Is it going to be through labour market action, universal basic income? What is it going to be? And when we get there, the umming and the ahhing takes over from the rather determined statements about we have too much inequality in the world.
Yes, doing is always harder than talking, isn't it? Leslie, let me ask you, you actually originally brought up this point in the introductory comments when you were pointing out that even big emerging economies or lower income economies in Africa were not responsible for generating a lot of the carbon emissions that have got us to this dreadful plight now. And that may be where the negotiating stance comes from, and perhaps hard lines are taken, which means at G20, at COP26, it's hard to get the movement because people are saying, I didn't cause this problem. Why am I having to, when my people aren't per capita as rich as yours, having to do this? How do multilateral organizations overcome that sort of blockage, or international ones even, in the fora that we see these decisions being made?
Look, it's a very difficult issue, and the issue surfaced very prominently in 2015 during during the Paris climate negotiations, and it will remain a central piece of the conversation around global solidarity, as Guy has just outlined. I think, though, that to come also to your point around the lowest common denominator as one of the structural weaknesses of the multilateral system, I'm really persuaded by the view expressed by many people now, including Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, that it is time to rethink multilateral institutions, to look at what are the limitations and some of the structural gaps that needs to be looked at, and potential reinvention. A number of the core features of the model of what we put in place post-1944 still remain in place today. There are still issues around voice, as I mentioned, or I might have mentioned earlier on, about 2/3 of the world economy now comprise emerging markets and developing countries. That was not the case 30 years ago. The rise of China and India and Brazil and all these other large emerging markets do not have a proportionate voice to their economic size in multilateral institutions. So voice reform is one aspect, but there are also other elements of multilateral institutions that need some reform. There's still, slow-moving bureaucracies. We need to embed the agility and the speed, which is what we demonstrated during COVID. I would argue that the institutions, multilaterals, managed to act with speed, incredible speed, and with, for example, fast-tracking their approval procedures, getting the disbursements out of the door to rescue a lot of the companies, small businesses that were going under. But the scale was not very impressive. So on speed we managed, but on scale we were underwhelming. And just to illustrate that point, there were several studies that have been done recently, one by the Center for Global Development, which demonstrates conclusively that the size of the response in proportionate terms to the global financial crisis relative to this crisis, which is much bigger, is the response today is less than half what it was in 2008. So if you look at the MDBs, the combined collective response, lending increased by about 39% now, whereas it increased over 78% during the global financial crisis. I guess what I'm saying in short is that although we're talking about the importance of these institutions, there are also weaknesses that we need to address as we prepare or look at our preparedness for the next crisis that may confront us.
Thank you. You remind us very wisely, Leslie, that we seem to move seamlessly in the last couple of decades from one crisis to another, each of which seems to be the worst you're ever going to live through before you get the next one. We're starting to get questions in, but I'd like, before we get to them, and some really great ones, to ask Odile and Guy, if you raised a really great point about the need for reform and how multilateral sort of institutions like your own, like the ones Guy and Odile work for, may perhaps need reform. Can I ask Guy, Odile, what sort of changes you think in the nature of the institution, the business model, or the multilateral capacity, lending capacities that institutions like the IMF, the EBRD have? What sort of changes are needed in order to help us achieve this greener, fairer society? Let me start with Odile and then throw it to Guy.
No, I wanted just to start by with a positive note, which is I think that I've not looked at the study from the CDG, but I think when you look at the response in for this crisis, and for example the recent decision on SDR allocation and so forth, I mean, of course, it has not been. I mean, there are issues. There are issues related to vaccine. I think the key issue is access to vaccine, because I mean, it's I think it's a bit of short-sighted approach, because as it was said, we know that the pandemic will not be solved until it's solved everywhere. So otherwise, it will come back and haunt us and so forth. So I think this has been a key challenge and remains a key challenge. But on the rapidity and the strength of the support, I think it has proven quite, I mean, something already. I think and much more rapid, and I think that the overall response globally has been much stronger and more rapid than it was in the global financial crisis. We are not out of the woods. I think that there is the big issue of the divergence, and in particular, I mean, as I was saying, the vaccine, but also the difference in access in the policy margins in terms of budgetary support and monetary margin of maneuver, which may have an impact. And I think that we need to be extremely careful and be ready to react quickly. But this being said, I think that, I mean, in the very short term, the last year in 2020 and so forth, the crisis response was not so bad. On what are the reforms moving forward, I think involving, and that's one of the features of the EBRD, which, as the other MDBs, that we have all the countries in which we intervene very much part of the governance of the institution. I mean, of course, they're sharing the capital are quite different between, but across countries. But the presence in the policy making and in the definition of the policies, I think they are very much involved. All our countries of operation, and we work very much in a sort of partnership with them in defining the priorities and the country strategies and so forth. So I think that's an important dimension of the policies we are implementing, and it's sort of co-construction. It's not coming from the top, from the bank and going, but it's really developed with the support of the countries and in close cooperation with the authorities of the countries, and then focusing on the private sector. But indeed, globally speaking, it's clear that Bretton Woods institution and more globally speaking, MDBs have been, have to take into account the evolving balance of the world equilibrium. And there has each reform has been each reform of the voice, quotas, and so forth as all. And I think this for the legitimacy of the institution and their political legitimacy worldwide, it's very important to adjust to the new trends and the new balances.
Brilliant, thank you. Guy, let me ask you from your vantage point, obviously again slightly different, as I mentioned before, but you're seeing, parallel institutions, how they're coping. What do you think in terms of reform, or how the business model, if you like, of multilaterals, could they be better run, better approach these problems that we face?
But we certainly can do better in the multilateral system in terms of our own internal organization, on nimbleness. We're not marked by agility and quick response in our business model. That is absolutely the case. And indeed, there are, and Leslie's pointed to them, very long-running and very important discussions about the fairness of who has real decision-making powers, veto powers in the Security Council, and so on. But I think there's a more important point. We can certainly reorganize and redesign our own machinery. But in the end, and I'm afraid I hope this isn't seen as just trying to avoid the question, a lot depends, I'm not going to say everything, but a lot depends not on the machinery that you have at your disposal, but the use that is made of that machinery and the intent and the commitment of member states to use that machinery to best effect. Let's be honest, the commitment, the intent with which member states come to multilateral organizations is not everything that it might be at the moment. And I think the solutions there lie outside the immediate capacity of at least my multilateral organization. Yes, we can redesign. Yes, we can reform. We can do all of those things. But I think there's a bigger question lying behind the problems that your question evokes. Can I just also take 1 minute to go back to this interesting comparison between how we did at managing the financial crisis 2008-2009 and the current one? Now, different crises, obviously different crises, raising different questions. Nevertheless, by our estimations, the labour market impact of the current crisis is 4 times as severe as what happened in 2008-2009 in terms of lost work, lost labour income, enterprise damage. Now, if you look back to 2008-2009, I mean, my memory is of a golden age of lasted about 15 months, 18 months. The G20 was set up in its current expression. We started in Washington, we went to London, we went to Pittsburgh. This was a golden age where the G20, specially designed because the existing multilateral institutions were not trusted for the job, to save the financial system. And then, well, we did a reasonable job. Jobs were saved. The financial system was saved from the worst. And then austerity set in with a big kick as the euro crisis set in. It was a short-lived golden moment. I won't call it a golden age, a golden moment of not multilateral, but international cooperation. And it produced some very good results. But when the golden moment ended, we had this, premature austerity and the long dragged out suffering of this uneven, frankly, recovery process that was not really complete by the time COVID-19 hit us. I'm much less benign about how the system has done in responding to this crisis. I missed the multilateral cooperation that produced the good. I missed that. What I saw was an aggregation of unilateral responses adding up to $16 trillion in stimulus message. I don't see much multilateral involvement in that. On vaccinations, I would be less sanguine than others about how well our excellent neighbours and colleagues at the WHO were able to do in producing some sort of cohesive multilateral reaction. So we've thrown a hell of a lot of money at the problem and to good effect in some places, but it's been massively, massively uneven. The developing and the emerging world's been left to its own devices, and they are, and I fear will continue to suffer the consequences of that abandonment in the months ahead. And it's that type of unfairness, if you like, and the absence of the type of, how can I put it, coherency that a multilateral approach and decency that a multilateral approach should be able to bring to the story that I think has marked the current response. So a lot of money, a lot of effort, but a lot missing too.
Leslie, I think you probably wanted to come in on some of those thoughts that Guy was mentioning.
Just very briefly to accentuate the point around the 2008 crisis. As you know, in 2009, emerging markets and developing countries still grew at 2.5%, right? And in 2020, emerging market and developing countries' overall GDP shrank by 2.2%. So the depth of the crisis, the impact on human lives, the impact on the poor had just been so much bigger. And yet the total fiscal response, as Guy has just said, has been so disproportionate. About something almost 20% of GDP is what advanced countries have spent in fiscal stimulus. The number is 6% for middle-income countries and 2% for low-income countries. So, vaccine solidarity is at the heart of, or the lack of vaccine solidarity is at the heart of this unequal response.
Thank you. Let me take one of the questions that's come in. I don't unfortunately have the name of the person who put the question, but it's very relevant. So the question is, everyone's aware that the future of our world, referring to climate change, depends and relies on the green economy. But is the green economy, quote marks, economically sustainable? I think what the question's quite clearly getting at is we saw the reduction in carbon emissions when nobody was allowed to travel and the skies suddenly cleared up, or there wasn't sort of industrial production as much. But if we're not going to be flying, we're not going to be consuming so many things or clothes or traveling everywhere, is that actually the sort of economic pace of economic growth that we've been used to, and can we recover that? Odile, let me throw that to you to start with. And
it's clear that tackling the climate change and reaching the net zero and so forth, it's a huge, will entail huge cost and huge transition in everything we are doing, traveling, the houses, the work, everything we produce and so forth. So it's a huge shock, but it's of course reachable. I think it will require huge efforts, but I don't think that we have the choice. And in a way, I think that we need to deepen very much the way we measure the impact. Also, if we want to design appropriate manners to accompany it, to facilitate it, and so forth, we need to be clearer and have better understanding about the overall impact. And I think it can be. I've read, article recently explaining that it would, comparing that with the oil shock of the 70s. And the impact on the GDP of the same kind of magnitude that we had with the oil shock. And this oil shock, remember, indeed shifted a lot of the production, the consumption, and so forth. So I think we really need to think about a sort of big supply shock and to work around that and to find ways to smoothen the effect and so forth. But there is no other alternative, I would say, no other choice.
Leslie, can I ask you very quickly to address that before I go to Guy?
Very briefly, I would say that there's been considerable studies done in the world of finance, in the world of economics, indicating that it is both economically feasible and that it, in fact, represents one of the biggest historical opportunities. Mark Carney, who's leading the COP26 in Glasgow, says this will be the biggest reallocation of capital in memory, in the memory of in the history of capital markets. Essentially, what he's saying is that it doesn't mean that we will have to fundamentally alter our lives. It will simply mean that new business models, and this is about the belief in technology and the belief in innovation, that new approaches, new business models, new strategies to redesign the way we live, the way we work, will in fact create new opportunities. So the mindset is one of opportunity rather than one of constraints. It is technically feasible, according to those who are sort of deep, rooted in technology. Some of the leading companies today, BlackRock, for example, which is the biggest asset manager in the world, is already now indicating, because they consider climate risk as one of the key central investment risks, they will make ESG one of the core central pieces of their strategic asset allocation decisions. So it's not an additional thing to do because, there's some compliance required. It becomes the sort of essential framework of making capital allocation decisions. So I guess what I'm saying is that it presents a massive opportunity.
Guy, very quickly over to you.
Well, I agree with Odile, who says that we don't have much choice in the matter, or any choice in the matter in the first place. And I agree with Leslie, who says there's opportunity in all of this. There is massive opportunity. So I think you've got to put those two thoughts together. Not underestimate, I don't think we should, the nature of the change, the size of the disruption that we are deliberately having to head for now. But, there are other ways of reconceptualizing what we aim for in our economic activity, both in production and consumption. Maybe it's not GDP and GDP growth alone by which we measure the success of our economies and the viability of our enterprises. So, people are talking much more about well-being budgeting, well-being economies. I think there is a real reconceptualization, which doesn't come along very often in history. But I, like Odile and like Leslie, prefer to look on the positive side of this. I truly believe, not as making a virtue of necessity, that there are genuine opportunities here. And to live and to grow better.
Perfect. I can't believe we've run out of time quite so quickly. But anyway, let me ask you just very last round to end on the positive and the opportunities, as you've all stressed. If I could ask each of you to tell me in a minute or less what your institution is prioritizing or planning in the next 12 months to really move the needle on a greener, fairer society. Let me throw it to Leslie first, Guy, and then I'll end it with Odile. Go for it, Leslie.
Thank you very much. New Development Bank, like EBRD in Odile's case and all the others, have placed climate finance right at the center of our business model. I know EBRD has a target of 50%. We have a target of 40%, which is really bringing all of our financing in line with the commitments made in Paris. So we will be very focused on ensuring that all of our lending activities is geared towards climate finance. New Development Bank is also expanding now, bringing in new members and becoming much more of an emerging markets institution beyond only the BRICS countries. Again, our aim would be to focus over the next 12 months on these issues of just transition that we've outlined earlier on, to ensure that there is fairness and equity in the way that we implement the transition strategies. But we are very, very confident and optimistic that come COP26, there's going to be some global accord that will propel us forward into a new era.
Thank you, Leslie. Guy, over to you.
Well, building on work we did in our centenary year in 2019 on the future of work, we had a major declaration on the future of work, trying to already pre-COVID identify the key dynamics and challenges of a world of work in transition, digitalization, as well as climate change, demographic change, a world changing at an extraordinary pace. We've now had to adapt that to a COVID environment. We adopted in our conference a call to action for what we call a human-centered recovery. And we'll be taking that forward, both at the UN, at the General Assembly, later in the month, in national dialogues in our member states involving governments, employers and workers on what these transitions really come down to when it comes to national political decisions. And we hope to be involved in the multilateral forum early next year to try to bring all of this together and try to work with our partners to bring the impact that we all urgently need. And of course, we all hope for that positive outcome at COP26 upon which to also build.
Odile, final word over to you.
Thank you. Just to say that we also see, I didn't want to appear pessimistic about the transition. I think we have to do it. And I think indeed there are some opportunities, but we should also be aware of the cost in order to be able to address them. And I think in terms of opportunity, it is very important is to help every country to be able to seize the opportunity of the transition. Because what's clear for me also is that if you are not moving into that direction, it will be much more difficult later on. We've discussed a bit, Leslie mentioned a bit at the beginning, the risk of barriers and so forth. But if now we can see already some pressure on different countries in order to get clean energy and so forth, because investors will look for places to invest with clean energy, with green infrastructure and so forth. So that's absolutely key. And what we do to support countries to move into that direction is provide finance, but also provide strategic policy advice on how to adjust the regulatory framework to attract investment, to do that, how to use new technologies and so forth. And third is to work with other MDBs in order to try to have a coordinated approach, same definition of what is green, same definition of what is Paris alignment, and also with the private sector to have this kind of taxonomy and same reference, because at a time where everybody will want to support the green transition, having common language, common approach, and so forth will be very important in order to be sure that we are transparent, understandable, and that we are not greenwashing, but really doing something green.
Great, perfect. On that positive note, I will thank all of our panelists, Odile, Leslie, and Guy, for joining us and for such a frank and interesting exchange. Thank you all who've been tuning in to this session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the IEFA's Conference of Montreal. Thank you all.